ladies and gentlemen. You are listening to Campfire Catholicism. I am your host, Elton Jarvis. Happy Easter Wednesday. Or at least it is Easter Wednesday during this recording. And I believe this will also be put out on the Easter Wednesday as well. Now, if this is your first time listening to this podcast, well, firstly, this is a podcast about how story reveals who we are and whose we are. And how we do this is we look over Catholic themes in popular books and in popular media, and what it reveals about the reality we live in. Secondly, this is the 6th episode, I believe, in our Adventuring into Tolkienverse series, which revolves around the Lord of the Rings. And I do take some inspiration from Peter Kreeft on this show. So if there are any of you guys that are listening to this episode, and have not listened to the other episodes, I do suggest that you do so. However, feel free to stay and listen to this one, where we are talking about the resurrection and where we can find the resurrection in Tolkien's works, specifically The Lord of the Rings. That's the primary work that I really focus on. Okay, so, side note, I used to play this game called World of Warcraft, which is an MMORPG game. That stands for Massively Multiplayer Online Role-Playing Game. And basically you can create a character, fight monsters, level up, all of that shenanigans, just anything that an MMORPG does. Well, in that game, when you die, your soul, or I guess your ghost, it leaves your body. Although you do have the choice to stay in your body or not. If you choose to stay in your body, you have to wait about, I believe it was like 6 or 7 minutes until you could play again, or you could just become a ghost. And so what you end up having to do is you have to either go back into your body where you ended up dying, or you have to go to the graveyard where you can be resurrected. Now, when I was a young lad, I think I was around maybe 9 or 10 years old, this was very, very problematic for me. Because if you died in an area where there was high-level enemies, you would have to pass through that area and try and get your body. But from what I remember is that you lose all your buffs and your debuffs. Basically, you're really squishy when you're a ghost. And so I spent many a times upset during the course of my youth because of the experience that I had in trying to get back to my body. It was just crazy. I didn't have a lot of friends that played World of Warcraft with me at the time. But if you also had a friend that was a specific class, it could have been a cleric or a priest or something like that, they could also resurrect you. And so it's too bad, because when I was I was a very avid gamer when I was growing up, but I would always play games by myself, and I wouldn't play a lot of games with people per se. A lot of the games that I would play would literally be solo, and then I would end up wasting about however many hours playing it. Anyways, side note. So resurrection, like the resurrection in general, not the resurrection of Jesus, but the topic of resurrection isn't that of World of Warcraft. So you don't have to go through all of that hard work having to run back to your body or anything. You also don't repeatedly resurrect multiple times in your earthly life. A lot of Eastern religions do believe in the idea of reincarnation. In other words for reincarnation are rebirth and transmigration. The religions that do believe in this idea consists of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Sikhism, and I'm sure there are many others that are out there. I'm just focusing on the 3 major ones in regards to reincarnation now. In regards to Western civilization, reincarnation would belong to a branch of the overall tree of New Age beliefs. New Age is defined as a movement that has an alternative approach to traditional Western culture with an interest in spirituality, mysticism, holism, and environmentalism. That is how it manifests. Now, in a recent Pew study a few years ago, just type in Pew Research Center on the internet, they do remarkable research. There is a total of 7 out of 10 U.S. Catholics, that is United States Catholics, American Catholics, that hold one New Age belief, with a total of 36% holding a belief in reincarnation. Now, there's something that we do have in common with reincarnation. Both reincarnation and resurrection both affirm the belief in the immortal soul. And so that is something that we can think about. The soul is in fact and indeed immortal. Therefore, if the soul is immortal, then what we believe about it has such a huge importance. What did Tolkien have to say about the soul? And more specifically, what did he have to say about the resurrection? Now, I'm going to go over 3 instances where we can see the resurrection narrative in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Firstly, I'm going to mention and talk about Gandalf and his entry into the mines of Moria alongside the Fellowship. Now, Gandalf is a primary Christ-like figure in the Lord of the Rings, one of the more explicit ones that we can perceive. Gandalf is leading the Fellowship through the mines of Moria, which Boromir mentions that it is a tomb. Later on, as they pass through, they find the tomb of Balin, one of the dwarfs. Now, the mine is indeed a tomb, which is in reference to death. And Gandalf passing through the mine, leading the Fellowship through it, is synonymous to Christ leading us to death, and more so through death. As they journey on through the desolate mine, they eventually come into confrontation with a Balrog. And Gandalf does battle with it. There's a scene, I love the scene. There's a scene in the Two Towers where Gandalf gets pulled down from the bridge of Khazad-dûm. And you see Gandalf diving toward the Balrog, and he snatches his sword while falling, and he plunges it into the Balrog. And the musical score while this is happening is absolutely exhilarating. That scene, in a way, is symbolizing Christ descending into hell and defeating death by death. What ends up happening is, after the battle climaxes, and we see this later on in the Two Towers where they're up on top of the mountain and they're doing battle, Gandalf dies. But then he is sent back as Gandalf the White, so there is a resurrection that happens with Gandalf. He becomes Gandalf the White. Second moment that I want to mention in regards to resurrection, although it's not so explicit, it's Frodo. Now, he carries the One Ring up to Mount Doom, which becomes like a crushing weight, similar to how Christ carried the cross, which becomes a crushing weight for him. When Frodo accomplishes his mission, well, although it was actually Gollum that destroys the ring, Frodo says, "It is done." Very similar to how Christ exclaims, "It is done," before he gives us his spirit on the cross. It is finished. And afterwards, when Christ ascends to heaven, it's just like Frodo going to the Undying Lands, leaving Middle-earth after his mission is complete. So that's another idea. And then the last moment that I want to talk about as well, or mention, is in regards to Aragorn. Now, Aragorn passes through the halls of the dead, very, very similar to Gandalf. And to, again, Jesus Christ. Aragorn is another Christ-like figure alongside Frodo and Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings. Again, one of the more major ones. But he returns, after he passes through the halls of the dead, he returns as the new king of Gondor, no longer the ranger he once was. The old self has been put to death. Now, the white tree of Gondor stands dry and lifeless throughout the centuries in Minas Tirith. But when Aragorn returns to the city, he brings a sapling of the white tree. So a tree does represent growth and resurrection. And Aragorn brings a brand new sapling. This can also be, the two trees, it can be synonymous to the two trees in Scripture. The white tree that stands lifeless is similar to the tree that Adam and Eve ate from, causing our original sin and death. But Christ's death upon the new tree, which is the cross, brought about new life. Like through his death, it brings about new life in him, free from original sin and death. And that's represented by that sapling that Aragorn brings. And who is Aragorn? Well, he is the king, and Jesus is the King of Kings, and so forth. So, there are 3 variants of the resurrection amidst many little deaths and resurrections in Middle-earth. Unfortunately, because of the time that I do have, we don't have the time to go through each and every single one of them. So in order to have a resurrection, there needs to be a death, because something that has been resurrected would imply that it has been dead in the first place. You can't resurrect something that has not been dead in the first place. And it is different than, say, resuscitation. Okay, so now, how is reincarnation and resurrection different? Well, reincarnation means that the soul, which is still the same soul, has been incarnated in a different body, whether animal or even human. And so with reincarnation comes the belief that for a creature, they will undergo multiple physical deaths. However, as we see in these instances of the Lord of the Rings, Aragorn passes through the halls of the dead once. So too, Frodo destroys the ring. Well, again, Gollum destroys the ring. Frodo accomplishes his mission at Mount Doom once. Finally, Gandalf has only died to the Balrog once. This is where Tolkien's Catholic theology permeates in his work. By the way, before I even get on to the rest of this, I should say that this isn't allegory, because Tolkien didn't intentionally put this in. He was just telling a good story. The allegory comes from, in a sense, our interpretation on what Tolkien has written. Tolkien didn't intentionally do this. However, again, I believe that stories can reveal who we are and whose we are, and it is only inevitable that we can find these truths to what is said here, or to what is shown. Now, how can all of this show us the resurrection? Well, it can show us that since these characters who are Christ figures die once, so too Jesus Christ has also died once. Once a death on the cross, and then he was resurrected and ascended into heaven. Only once. Gandalf being brought back to life while he is Gandalf the White, it is still the same body, not a different one. However, it is a glorified body. In fact, he was able to reveal more of his divine power. Again, Gandalf is one of the Astari. He's a wizard, but a wizard or an Astari in Tolkienverse, that's my new name for the lore of Tolkien. Tolkienverse he is a Mire. Now, a Mire, if you've listened to my previous episode, a Mire is an angel in a sense. It is an angelic spirit that was created by Eru Ilúvatar, who is God before Middle Earth was created. In fact, the Ainur, all of the angelic spirits, they helped create Middle Earth alongside Ilúvatar's design for Middle Earth. Anyways, you can look at that episode too. It's, I think, Angelology and the Creation Narrative. I believe that's what the episode is called. Anyways, it's still the same body, but it is a glorified one. He is able to reveal more of his divine nature, his divine power. And it's still the same soul. It's still Gandalf, even though it's Gandalf the White. It's still the same Mire soul that came back. Okay. In Catholic theology, we are made of body and soul, which are composite of each other. Not just the soul and not just the body, but it is both which constitutes an individual. I'm going to repeat that one more time. In our Catholic theology, we are made of body and soul, composite of each other, not just soul and not just body, but both which constitutes an individual. It is also not a different body that Jesus also comes back into. It is still the same body. Hence, it also bears the same wounds, the wounds on the cross. 2 wounds on the hands, 2 wounds on the feet, 1 wound upon his side. It is still the same body, but it is a glorified body. And it is the same divine soul. It is the God-man, our blessed Lord. So what does this all mean in regards to the moments of resurrection that we can find in the Lord of the Rings, in Tolkien's works, and what can the resurrection mean to us personally? Here's what I do believe it means, and I will conclude with this. The resurrection is depicted in Tolkien's works, and like all stories, it reveals to us again who we are and whose we are. So, since Gandalf, Frodo, and Aragorn go through their little death and their little resurrection, and since they are Christ-like figures in this story, and Christ is a historical person that did exist, in which the resurrection did claim to happen, then if the resurrection is true, this could also mean that it is true for us. Jesus has resurrected from the dead. This resurrection's for us. Here's the bad news of all of this. Again, going back to what I said a little bit briefly before, and you can even listen to it on my previous episode. The reality is there is death, and death is the ultimate culmination of suffering that we can ever experience in this life, that we can ever experience on this earth. And that's a very, very difficult truth. We do suffer, and we do have an earthly death. But the good news is that we only go through that nature of suffering, that nature of death once. See, in reincarnation, you would have to believe that we have died multiple times over and over again. That would also imply that you could argue, again, it depends on, like I suppose your past life, but you would have to die and you would have to suffer in earthly life multiple times over and over and over again until you achieve a state of nirvana or some sense of consciousness, anything. That would seem really unmerciful. I understand that we are not worthy, but it is still very unmerciful, the fact that we would have to go through that over and over and over again. So much suffering. In the Christian worldview of the resurrection, we only need to suffer once. We only need to die once. I'm not saying that we only need to suffer like one specific time in the earth and then the rest of your earthly life there is no suffering. That's not what I'm saying. We only have a culmination of earthly suffering once and an earthly death once. But then there is a resurrection. There is a resurrection. We are glorified. Our bodies are glorified in the resurrection. Just as he has come before, our blessed Lord, Jesus, suffered a very excruciating death upon the cross. If any of you guys that have watched Mel Gibson's Passion, that is the closest rendition that we can get to what the Passion would have been like. Although, it would have been a lot worse. The Passion narrative is very, very excruciating amidst the emotional torment of being abandoned by his loved ones, his disciples, and being subjected to an unfair trial. Have you ever been accused falsely in your life? Jesus has. He's been accused falsely and has been dealt under the table. Have you ever been beaten up, maybe in your everyday life, or any of you guys that have been bullied? In the sense of being mocked and beaten up, well, Christ went through that as well. He was scourged and he was pummeled. Not a whip, no. It was a flagrum that scourged him and it tore his flesh right off his back. And then having to carry a cross for gosh knows how many miles. I believe it was about an hour and a half, though, according to biblical scholars and what they said on how long he had to carry the cross. Have you ever had to do something that you didn't want to do? Or do something for somebody that you didn't like? And then it all culminated upon Calvary, where he was crucified, his whole body. And he had to hang upon there. And as he was hanging upon the cross, he was praying and he was mediating for all of us, even for the people that would know about his sacrifice but wouldn't even love him back. He still died for them, because love is a choice, ultimately. The love that he has for us is called agape. It's a Greek word. It's unconditional love. Later on in a future Fairy Tale Friday episode, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that, and perhaps I'll even talk about it here as well. But 3 days later, he rises from the dead because he is God. And he says too that if we believe in him, believe the words that he has spoken, then we too also get to share in that resurrection. We see the resurrection in the Lord of the Rings, but it is a reality in which it is possible for us so long as we believe in it. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode and what was spoken about in regards to the resurrection. If you liked this episode, well, I'm glad. Please listen to any of the other ones if you haven't listened to them already. And do us a really good favor. If you know if you know 3 individuals that have not heard of this podcast, please give it to them. Let them have a listen. If they like it, then great. If they don't, that's fine. I'm really going to do my best to try and build this because I have been getting a lot of feedback that the content is good, which is great. And the only reason why I'm doing this is, not only contemplating the mystery of story and what it can reveal to us about Christianity and the reality in which we live in. Again, story reveals who we are and whose we are. That is probably, I think, the 3rd time that I have said this already. This truth is not only for me, but it is for everybody. It really is. And so if you find that this information is good, then share it. Share it with individuals. And then I suppose it is up to them to listen to it or not. So feel free to continue listening on Spotify. I'm also on Apple Podcasts. I was going to say Apple Podcasts, and also on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook. Follow us on Instagram. Hopefully one of these days in the future, I will be having a website, so you could also check me out on the website as well. You have been listening to Campfire Catholicism. I am your host, Elton Jarvis. Take care. Have a good rest of your Easter week.